All right. So welcome everyone. It's great. It's great to have you here. So this is our first installment of our webinar series, Law and Political Economy and Heterodox Economics. And our intention with this series is to build a stronger interdisciplinary dialogue with political economists that will hopefully enrich law and political economy research, targeting perhaps even more specifically legal work that seeks to explicitly draw from and engage with institutional, with heterodox economics and with Marxist traditions of economic thought. And today we are delighted to have with us Professor Jamee Moudud to kick off this series. Professor Moudud is a professor at Sarah Lawrence College and a co-founder of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. So Jamee, if I may, has been working at the intersection of political economy and law, which really makes him, in our eyes, the ideal candidate to kick off this webinar series. His research focuses on the legal foundations of markets and money. And these actually, these two will constitute the key axis, so to say, of our discussion here today. So on one hand, we want to explore a little bit more in depth the question of the legal underpinnings of markets and a political economy take on the legal economic nexus. So a discussion that we often had in law and political economy circles, but let's say through the eyes of a political economist. And the second key topic is that of money. Um, More specifically, our discussion draws inspiration from Jamee's book In Progress, Legal and Political Foundations of Capitalism, The End of Laissez Faire, which is really a title that we're waiting for. And I think, and I'm sure that the other co-panelists here agree, will be a key contribution for the law and political economy field. So from law and political economy in Europe, we have also, of course, with us, Dr. Anna Chadwick, of course. Anna, hi. We have Professor Marco Goldoni. Great to have you, Marco, and we have prepared some questions. And also Professor John Haskell, also great to have you here, John. And we have, I'm hoping, yes, and some other members of the audience. So I see Josie Baker, so great to have you here. So yeah, that sort of sets the scene. So we have prepared, let's say, some questions to sort of start, Jamee. But well, the setting is and the format is meant to be informal. So we'll try to largely follow this trajectory of starting with a more like theoretical part of Jamee's work on broadly theoretical speaking on the conceptualization of markets, and then move on to money. But obviously this is just a loose format, so I invite everyone to feel free to jump in. Maybe just raise your hand and we'll moderate the discussion. So we're trying to keep a good flow. And yeah, so Jamee, thank you for coming. So the first question is to start on this, your discussion on the legal economic nexus as you develop it in the book. Your analysis starts by using the so-called third way politics as the historical backdrop, and I think many of us here in Europe would also identify, whether relate, let's say, to that kind of diagnosis. And then you identify new Keynesianism and new institutional economics as the intellectual foundations of this third way politics. So could you perhaps, as a way to start the discussion, elaborate a little bit more on these schools of thought? So what are these and how do they conceptualize the market, and what space do they reserve for law?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the invitation. So third wave politics is obviously a political movement that, as all of you know, sort of became established in the mid-1990s, right, with Tony Blair and Bill Clinton over here. And the idea in that tradition, that's a political tradition, but then we have the intellectual basis, which is some kind of a mishmash of new Keynesian economics. Explain that in 1 minute. And this idea of new institutional economics, the idea is that markets are conceptualized as being pre-political. I mean, it's foundationally related, based in the idea that there's something called a perfect market. And so now, depending on where you are in terms of your politics, then you could say that, well, so we want the free market. But maybe markets fail. And this is an old trope in neoclassical economics. Market failure may justify some kind of state intervention. So again, the assumption being it's a standard neoclassical framework, that the separability of the polity and the economy, markets are their own thing, property and contracts and so on. And so institutions, and I think the best example Joseph Stiglitz, who got the Nobel Prize, new Keynesian economics, would be that, okay, so now that we have market failure, and then all the problems of capitalism, unemployment, high levels of inequality, these kinds of things would be considered to be market failure, would imply some sort of intervention. But the basic analysis is, and this is really new institutional economics, is that politics and the law would need to be protective of markets, where markets themselves are pre-political. And occasionally you might need to mess around with them in case they fail, right? Now, the other thing that new institutional economics does is that it adopts, as they say, the core assumptions of neoclassical economics, including the theory of money, which is the claim that the money supply needs to be controlled by the central bank. And that has a whole series of assumptions built into it, which heterodox economists from post-Keynesian economics to Marxian economics have challenged that for a very long time, and we can talk more about that later on. But at any rate, the idea here is that markets are conceptualized, broadly speaking, as being pre-political, and then depending on your ideological inclinations, you may want more or less free markets. And certainly, the other issue here is a general support of austerity programs, including amongst neoclassical, new Keynesian economists, more or less balanced budgets, maybe with a little bit of budgetary deficit from time to time, and central bank independence and the protection of property rights and markets. So there you get, and free trade. So now you've got pretty much the entire apparatus. As I say, this may not happen rapidly as in the old shock therapy programs of the 1980s. This is Douglas North's point. So what you need is a little bit of nudging, a little bit of pushing things in a way that could cushion the blows of global integration and free markets. That's, in sum, as I understand it, what that whole tradition is all about.
Thanks, Jamee. So I have a follow-up question to that, which is a core argument in your work is that there are no free markets. And an example that you give is the notion of price setting as a normal feature of competition. Right. And you argue that prices are set within firms to satisfy investment plans, and you thereby frame the firm as a planning institution. So my question there, well, there are two, is how does that reframing destabilize neoclassical assumptions about the economy? And how does it inform current debates about price controls as a means to counter inflation?
Right. Okay. So one of the things that, I have to preface that by saying that those of us who've had the pleasure or the lack thereof of teaching neoclassical microeconomics for many decades are always struck by the utter lack of reality when it comes to that, and particularly with regards to the way businesses behave in terms of their pricing. And I don't want to get too much into that, but one major issue is costs. So cost of production theory pricing as a ubiquitous phenomenon. Some firms are more capable of setting the price that they want than others. But if you say that prices are set on costs, then the question arises, what determines those costs? So costs are labor costs and non-labor costs. And the way that I have thought about this particular question is to say that, well, if you begin with the assumption that, in fact, businesses are embedded in society, and then the background rules of property and contracts and other kinds of laws that pertain to the legal design of markets would be the basis of those costs, right? And so you take, for example, unit prices, price per unit, say the price per unit of this laptop that I'm sitting in front of, as a function of unit labor cost, which is wage rate, hourly wage rate divided by labor productivity. Now, both the numerator and the denominator of unit labor costs is a function of wage struggles, of worker struggles relative to capital. And that puts you directly in the terrain of understanding labor struggles in the context of the deeper political hardwiring of markets or legal hardwiring of markets. How does that destabilize neoclassical economics? Well, it destabilizes neoclassical economics in several different ways. The first point is that this of cost-based pricing appears only as an incidental in certain neoclassical models, as a kind of a deviation from the baseline, either the theory of perfect competition or monopolistic competition. So it's in some models, they might have cost-based pricing, market failure, as they call it. So that's the first point. The second point is that there's no question. Oh, so one more thing. So if you argue, therefore, that prices are set on costs and that the firm is a planning institution, then that immediately pits decision makers within firms, within corporations, makes them engaged with the politics of the society. Is by definition a political creature. It's a political institution. It's not something that is sitting outside politics. It is embedded in politics. So you can begin to then understand the long history. If you look at the long, the sort of across space and time in so many different contexts of corporations, businesses being deeply embedded in attempting to change the regulatory framework that undergirds them, and society pushing back in the opposite direction, often through constitutional battles, this, that, and the other. But it makes the firm a political creature. In the neoclassical framework, it's not, right? It sets a price on the basis of some principle, which is not what firms actually do. And in the consequence, even that kind of price-setting behavior is a deviation. It's a market imperfection. Now, the baseline neoclassical model doesn't even allow for that. That's the theory of perfect competition setting. And each firm is a passive price taker. It's tiny, this, that, the other. All of general equilibrium theory, which undergirds global free markets and all of that presupposes perfect competition. So now you've got a theory of global free trade and free markets and all that as a kind of an aspirational goal to attain through a more rigorous application of the free market, of market forces. But in so doing, you then end up jettisoning the core identity of a firm. And one relapses then into this sort of unreal world of perfect competition and Walrasian general equilibrium theory, which, by the way, there's no money in that either. So now you don't have any money and you don't have price setting. And in so doing, you're in this other space. One final thing, and then I'll stop. Once you say that the firm is actually setting a price on its cost of production, and that also implies that the firm is a monetary institution. So think about Marx's circuit of capital, MC, right? MC, production, C prime, M prime. The circuit of capital is showing something rather important, which is the firm is a monetary institution. So money is hardwired into the structure of production relations and economic activity, as opposed to being exogenous, as in the neoclassical framework.
Can I jump in here about pricing? Yeah. So I find this actually really interesting and very much up to date. Like I have been following a little bit this discussion about price controls, and probably you have seen all the debate with Isabella Weber and so on. So I wanted to pick your brain on this. But before, maybe like a broader perspective. So you talk about the firm as a planning institution. So what do you see the role of the state to be with regards to price setting, in the sense that there is, for example, some legal scholarship that says, well, prices, in fact, should be understood as legally constructed, actually, in the first place, and the way in which, I don't know, public procurement, for example, benchmarks prices, or, of course, the fact that, market activity depends, if we take it one step even before that, the fact that market activity depends on certain legal priors, like, for example, let's say, the distribution of entitlements, or, like the resources that each one has, then that will eventually determine, let's say, supply and demand. So in that sense, we could see law and like public power being the ultimate, let's say, source of price. Would you subscribe to such an idea? Does this mean that essentially prices reflect some more arbitrary, let's say, valuation as opposed to some, inner logic of the market? And if that's the case, so where do you see the state with regards to prices, and where do you stand perhaps on this inflation debate that was very much in the news in the last months?
Sure. Okay, so I think that, first of all, I'm completely with Robert Hale on this, where Robert Hale says that there is no such thing as a free market price. I'm paraphrasing, because in fact, that firm sets a price itself reflects a legal arrangement. Now, that price could be, the legislature could allow that price to be set in the sense that, the price of bread, as far as, but the price of bread under certain circumstances may need to be controlled because most of the population doesn't have access to it. Think about COVID vaccines and the entire, in fact, the health system, in so many different countries. It's a particular legal design in terms of the accessibility and the affordability. So it profoundly reflects that accessibility or affordability, profoundly choices and political decisions. So that's where I locate the state, in the sense, again, I use the word, I'm a little nervous about using the word state, because, as you know, it's not a monolithic thing that's sitting up there. It reflects political struggle as it filters through the legislature and the courts and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, we use the word state as a shorthand. So there is legality built right there, even if whether or not you have a price control, right? The misleading nature of the neoclassical debate on this particular question is the following. So this is the usual story that you're told when you teach microeconomics, that, okay, let's say you want rent control in this particular city. Well, then the standard argument would be, yeah. Okay, so here's a supply-demand diagram, and you put in a rent control, you will have now shortages, right? This kind of an argument. And there's a kind of an axiomatic assumption that there was something called a free market price at which demand and supply cleared. And then the state comes in, the city government comes in and puts in this price and messes things up. But that's completely axiomatic. I mean, it's a circular reasoning. Always you have to do anything, because I mean, Hale would, for example, argue that, well, yeah, but where these houses, where this residential property sits, or these apartments sit, it's already based on many different laws, zoning laws and taxation laws and building safety laws and this, that, and the other. In fact, the very costs of production, as I argued earlier on, in the construction of these buildings already has embodied into it a legal design. So from that standpoint, no free political prices, all prices are political, in the sense that there's a legal design built into them. And then the question arises, okay, what happens if those prices are too high? And I think that's the question that you asked, Ioannis, and also Anna had asked that question, which is, okay, so if prices are too high, inflation, what's the solution there? And this is not so obvious because, I mean, one could easily say that, well, we put in price caps, but that depends on whether capital will how they will respond to that. I mean, there's always this problem of a pushback by industry in that, and that's a general challenge to any kind of progressive social policy, which is that pushback by industry. But one could presume, in the COVID years, for example, the shortages were really the basis of inflation. One could, rethink the whole production system in terms of expanding, in terms of expanding supply and so on. So there's other policies that themselves a product of law and political decisions. But I think the short answer to your question, I don't see prices as being pre-political. They are constructed within a particular legally constructed or politically constructed legal framework, and then the question and the power relations right there. And so that's the way I would see it. That doesn't necessarily imply that left-wing social forces can just come along and either, okay, this is what we want in terms of price of basic goods, and we will elect the legislature, we will elect a left-wing party to do so. I don't think it's so easy, and I don't think any of you would think that either. But that still doesn't take away from the basic principle.
Right. Great. So actually, this issue on industry pushback and potential limitations to progressive policies, as you talk about them, brings me to the next question that I had, which I think is something that preoccupies us, let's say, within LP in Europe a lot, because, well, very often there is this discussion that, well, LP started, let's say, in the US, which has it's a strong state power. So you can imagine that, perhaps the kind of public power that may be accumulated there could be, let's say, the lever to achieve, profound socioeconomic transformation. And the question that then comes up sort of inevitably, if you think of, law and political economy in different contexts, is whether, the state or any kind of centralized form of power could have the capacity to achieve similar kind of socioeconomic transformation. So my question there with regards to limitations of progressive policies is, how does your account address global integration as a limitation to potentially progressive policies, and this primacy of politics that emerges from law and political economy, and you talked about now prices being political and so on. How can that be meaningful in the context of globalized markets, and perhaps also, although I suspect this is something you will discuss later on when you talk about money, but in different contexts than the US, so in let's say in the European periphery, in the global South, etc., etc.
Globalization is hard for progressive policies. I mean, that's a simple answer to your question, because to the extent where there is an exit option or even the threat of an exit option, that kind of enforces the structural power of capital. I think a lot of the proposals of the LPE tradition reflects exactly that particular issue, that unless and until one can restructure, in terms of global arrangements. So, for example, this attempt by the Biden administration in the last 1 year, I believe, to have a minimum corporate taxation system across different countries, so that corporations cannot, sort of window shop I think that's a useful way of thinking about creating some sort of a limit on the ability for corporations to window shop policy, right? But as long as you have this possibility of window shopping, which is exactly why corporations push for that, you have this way by which domestic progressive policies could be restricted. Now, there's one way that I've thought a lot about in regards to this question, and I think in one of the chapters I actually talk about this, which is we know that industry gets billions of dollars of subsidies, and clawback provisions offered by the states, right? So we have a similar kind of a situation within the US, a microcosm of globalization, in which corporations can window shop across different state jurisdictions. Clawback provisions are basically that, which is a state offers all kinds of incentives, subsidies, this, that, and the other. But in principle, if those are linked to a quid pro quo, that, hey, you skip town, whenever you find a cheaper source of labor over there, you got to pay it back with interest, with compound interest or some such thing, right? Some way of a disciplining mechanism, because I think one lever that governments have is the reality of capitalism. It's been always the case, of billions of dollars of subsidies, but those are usually giveaways, and sort of give away billions of dollars of subsidies and then sit and pray that these guys will stay and invest. If we tied to an effective disciplining mechanism, a quid pro quo with teeth, I think that is a way of actually, so in other words, that, in some sense, I'm thinking theoretically of sort of redesigning the property rights of these corporations, that I give you this money, you, the corporation, but in return, the contract says you have to pay it back with compound interest or something like this if you, after a certain period of time or immediately. That, I think that's one way of doing it. But that requires another set of problems, which is you have to have this kind of, and I think in one of the questions you guys asked this question, which is the cultural power of the way people think about regulation and markets, right? As long as there's a kind of an underlying belief system that markets cannot really be tampered with because they're sort of in the sacred space, then I don't think that's going to work out. So there's got to be a lot of general understanding and consensus that markets are political constructions, and they could, in principle, tie in these kinds of disciplinary mechanisms to incentivizing business.
Thanks, Jamee. So there's so much there that we could also talk about, but actually I just wanted to move on a little bit to talk about some of your writing on money. So in your book, you argue that it's essential that we do away with the chimera of laissez-faire, and you argue that the reconstruction of economic theory requires a political economy framework. So what does that mean in the case of money, which is one of the key institutions that you're examining in your book, and how must we think of money differently under your political institutionalist lens?
So in order to answer that question, and this, one thing that should be made clear at the beginning is that in monetary theory, there's actually a debate, and it's gone on for a long time, which is that, okay, so you've got the neoclassical framework in which money is exogenous to the economy because the economy is fundamentally barter-based. But there is a long intellectual tradition going back to the banking school, to Marx, to Keynes, Veblen, Schumpeter, and of course reality, that says that in fact the economy is fundamentally monetary. In other words, it's not barter-based, it's fundamentally monetary. Money is endogenous. It's sort of built into the structure of society itself. Now, if you start from that argument, And then that's the first point. The second point is that if you also conceptualize society and the economy, which is buried in society, the sphere of production and exchange, as a political community, right? In other words, that you cannot conceptualize society as Hayek does. And Hayek's fundamental model is that society and the economy are fundamentally pre-political. But if you conceptualize society as fundamentally a political community, and I can talk more on that particular issue in just a minute, then something interesting follows, which is theoretically we understand that economic life, money is hardwired into economic life. As the endogenous money tradition has argued, that money by definition is a politically constructed legal institution. So that's the first point. The second point is that in terms of society being a political community, there are different ways by which you can sort of illustrate this point. One useful framing would be this extensive literature on sociology, which is a term coined by Rudolf Goldscheid, who was a German sociologist, and then later by Schumpeter and others. The system of public finance, taxation and debt, public debt, is so fused into society, it structures power relations and such in society, that you cannot really, one implication of that is that you cannot separate out the polity from the economy. And in fact, as perhaps there's this enormous literature in financial history, and Marx, at the end of volume 1 of Capital, actually has a very interesting discussion on this, on the national debt. And he says the national debt actually was the basis of financial market developments. And that argument has been made by many financial historians of the Marxist tradition, because that's empirically true. Now, if you think of it in that way, then of course the system of money that's floating laterally or horizontally within the economy has got to be linked to the system of money linking society and the economy to the state, right? The public finance system. But those have to be exactly the same unit of account. Otherwise, you cannot have different units of account floating around, which means that on both accounts, you have a monetary system that is fundamentally politically constituted and legally. Gold coins or bitcoins, or forget about bitcoins. No, gold coins or crypto or some kind of electronic system, whatever it may be, that it is ultimately has a legal basis. So that's broadly the way I think about that particular question.
Thanks, Jamee. So following on from that one, I think one of the great strengths of your book is how you engage with the links between, property, the firm, money. You kind of bring them together in a way that's not really been done before. And in the book, you also make these important linkages between domestic and international institutional frameworks. And you make the claim that the ability of a government to make adjustments to its property rights regime depends not only on constitutional clauses relating to property, which, as we know, in the US are very difficult to change, but also on its degree of monetary sovereignty. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that argument that you make, because I think it's a really important one. Thanks.
Yeah, so the way I thought about it was that that more often than not, if you have constitutional clauses pertaining to social and economic rights, but even if you didn't, and I'll come to that in just a minute, more often than not, that it requires outlays of public finance, right? I mean, whether it be for housing as a right, or healthcare, or whatever it may be. So one issue is that if you have sovereign debt which is denominated in a foreign currency, then, so I'm thinking here about, just in the European context, you take, say, Greece, right? In which, if you look at the Greek constitution, it has a whole series of very progressive features into it. But when the whole debt meltdown happened a few years ago, and the Greek government just could not, so it doesn't have full monetary sovereignty because of the legal design of the EMU. Pretty much most of those, many of those constitutional provisions were just violated, or they just couldn't size. And you see a similar situation in the case of South Africa, where sovereign debt in US dollars, very progressive constitution, but extremely difficult because of the weight of foreign creditors, and not only the IMF, but also international bondholders, international creditors, who are not, needless to say, particularly sympathetic to social justice, right? And so then it becomes extremely hard to actually swim against a tide which is pushing towards austerity, however progressive your constitutional framework would be. Now, there's another issue. Even if you don't have constitutionally protected social and economic rights, that is to say, the United States, in fact, the US, as you know, and I discussed this in that chapter, has a long history of progressive policies based on the police powers, the ability of state governments to actually restructure property rights in line with, let's say, public health needs. This goes back all the way back to the early years of the Republic, Commonwealth v. Algiers, 1851, and so on. But what's been happening, and so the police powers don't require any compensating payments to changes in property rights systems, right? Now, but over the years, especially since the late 70s, the early 80s, what's been happening is that the takings clause of the Constitution has been increasingly weaponized by right-wing Supreme Courts. What that basically means is that any change in property rights is now deemed to be not on the basis of police powers, but eminent domain, which means that a payment needs to be made to whoever, to the property right which is altered. Now that has a problem in countries like the U.S., in the poorer states like Louisiana and Mississippi, with smaller budgets compared to, let's say, Massachusetts and Connecticut, where I live over here. Internationally, to the extent where the takings clause or its equivalent has been weaponized by business forces, it makes it that much more difficult than to of property rights when you've got public finance constraints, because the country has not that much monetary sovereignty because of foreign debt or sovereign debt in a foreign currency, but also, like in the case of South Africa, you have central bank independence, which is codified in the Constitution. So now you don't really have access to this pool of money where one could potentially use the central bank, right, to finance, to be part of the public finance system to change property rights. It's kind of legally handcuffed. And so that's where the issue of monetary sovereignty and its diminished monetary sovereignty kicks in, and it creates widespread disillusionment, as you know, in the case of South Africa, where the Black majority correctly that their liberation struggle has been betrayed, despite the promises of that constitution.
Can I jump in and expand on this? Because we were intrigued by the, I would say, comparative dimension that you introduced in chapter 4, and then you mentioned again in chapter 5, which seems to basically, which compares basically 3 different constitutional experiences, in particular when it comes to the constitutionalization of property rights and socioeconomic rights more generally. That is the United States, South Africa, and Germany. And it seems to be that much of the comparison pivots around the notion of constitutional vulnerability, which I think you have already mentioned, I think, some of the constituent elements of that vulnerability, but there are, we would ask you to unpack further this, and also to basically explain why do you think that the German constitutional order seems to be less subject to that type of vulnerability, especially given the context where, I mean, you might argue, although of course this is context, that Germany is also deprived of monetary sovereignty.
So I'll start with the last one. About that diagram, right? And I was thinking, how do I have to make sure that I'm ranking in absolute terms, but in relative terms, right? So the fact that Germany is the least vulnerable does not mean no vulnerability in absolute terms. It's a relative thing, right? That's the first thing, and I might need to clarify that in the text. But also in terms of I was thinking a lot in terms of the question of vulnerability, placing it in the context of, well, first of all, Grégoire Chamayou's book, which my good friend John Haskell actually suggested to me, and it helped me a lot. Thank you for that, John. Which helped me a lot in sort of getting into this literature on authoritarian liberalism, right? And that I'm sure you know about, Hermann Heller's classic article written in 1933, and the critique of Carl Schmitt, and Carl Schmitt's, which I do in a later chapter, Carl Schmitt's close intellectual relationship to Hayek, right? So the idea of authoritarian liberalism, and there was, this, I mean, there was a 2015 special issue on Heller in the Europe. To Marco on authoritarian liberalism. I think you have. But anyways, the idea, so I'm really drawn from that tradition of that literature on the ability of on the construction of a central banking system that sharply curtails the ability of the legislature to actually implement progressive policies, right? So it doesn't really matter what you want. I mean, you can go and vote, and say in the European Union, go and vote, South Africa, et cetera. But the range of policies that you can actually implement is in part restrained by that design of the central banking system itself. And that makes it extremely hard then for leftist and forces to actually push through, or environmental forces to push through. Now, so that's that background. I think the other thing too is that the German case study was also trying to exemplify a point that in the case of Germany, right, for a number of historical reasons, which I talk about in that chapter, but also maybe in another chapter, industrial policy has played a very important role in making it, for longest time, an export powerhouse, which means a really important source of euros has come through that channel, through the balance of payments, as opposed to, let's say, Greece, where it's exactly the opposite, right? Which is persistent trade deficits, right? And so that, I think, is a really important point, that the way that these countries have somehow managed to integrate themselves and their performance is really quite important in terms of access to cash. Now, it's true that Germany does not have access to its own central bank, but it has that pump. And I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said that Germany spins like a top, meaning in terms of export revenues. And if that stops, then boom, it could collapse, right? And so that, I think, is the problem with South Africa, which adopted neoliberalism and free trade and all the rest of it, did not adopt an East Asian developmental strategy despite its constitution. And so it faces this finance constraint, which if you're higher up in the global hierarchy, even within a context where you don't have monetary sovereignty, as in the EMU context, is in a more privileged situation than, let's say, Greece is, or potentially Italy is. At least it's a relative thing.
And we insist on the constitutional arrangements of money, that it's clearly one of the threads that run across the whole book. I think there are some, in chapter 5, there are some important points, and I would like you to speculate about how, I mean, people interested in LP analysis might actually learn from some of the historical analysis that is contained there, especially in the construction of sovereign money in Europe and its impact on the colonies, and therefore on the external dimension of the European constitutional monetary arrangement. This is, of course, also way before World War II. What can we learn in terms of LP analysis from those experiences? So the hardwiring of a certain colonial dimension into sovereign money, and also on top of this, maybe you don't have a strong opinion on this, but I wonder whether, I mean, reading the chapter, I got the impression that you don't consider central banking as an unconditional achievement, meaning that under certain conditions, central banking actually is part and parcel, or was part and parcel, of at least the control of the domain of basically monetary power, of European monetary power over colonies, right? And this is clearly anti-Polanyian in a sense. No, Polanyi really thought that central banks, at least before Second World War, were fundamentally the real counter movement against the gold standard. And it's quite intriguing to see how you introduce some complexity there, no, to that analysis by saying, oh, look, hold on a second, it depends. I mean, domestically in certain cases might be, but then you also show how this was part and parcel of, European powers maintaining a certain level of monetary powers over their colonies.
Yeah, I think that's right. I never thought of that aspect of Polanyi. So, I need to sort of reread that. I'll write to you, and maybe you can suggest something that I can sort of weave into that on Polanyi. But I mean, it kind of exemplifies, one of the things that I just sort of wanted to do with this book was also pedagogical. In other words, what is LPE? And thinking about money as a political institution, understanding its global dimensions, right? That it can have different logics, as it were. Post Second World War and even before then, domestically, one logic as opposed to the colonies, right? So that's, I think, a kind of an underlying theoretical is as a governance institution and of power and sort of all that. There's other thing too, which is that and I'm sure you're familiar with Ha-Joon Chang's work, which Kicking Away the Ladder, and that whole idea that in fact a particular logic has been used historically to promote industrialization and economic development in the global north versus the global south, and then the history is just written out so that everybody talks about free trade as the way to sort of reduce global hierarchies. He doesn't talk about money. And I thought that it would be important to say that, okay, on the cusp of decolonization at the end of the Second World War, 1950s, you had a particular structure in place. In the case of, let's say, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, very different. So also colonies, but the dominions, as opposed to these other colonies of color. And that there was a particular monetary design by the colonial powers that constrained these colonies of color from industrializing, as opposed to the particular monetary design and other things gave greater autonomy to Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, with implications for subsequent trajectories as they integrated themselves into the post-war period. And that this was a particular a particular monetary design was in the colonies was not only not the case historically in Europe, but also in the 1950s, this very crucial time period when Europe is reindustrializing and reconstructing, and these very sort of, from our standpoint now, unorthodox central banking policies that, say France, the Bank of France, and so on, that were really important in promoting reconstruction and development. So in other words, looking at the global dimensions of power and inequality and the way money was used, the politics of money structured that. Yeah.
Perfect. John, you want to ask?
I have a question. Thanks for this this event. Really nice. Jamee, as I understand it, for me, capitalism is oftentimes really about money pricing, valuation, capitalization. That's really at the heart of it. And you could get rid of private property and still have capitalism, strangely enough. And we could have a real fun thought experiment down that way and debate. And so I'm just telling you my bias a little bit. And one of the things I find very interesting in your work is that when you turn us to look at the firm, there's the property story. Private property almost deductively, maybe that's not fair, imposes social costs. Let's see how the firm does that, and we're looking at a labor struggle and all that. And then on the other hand, has a different story in some way, which is that we can not even care about the private property story. We'll look at how firms do valuation and pricing and all sorts of accounting and stuff like that. It's a different type of story. I wonder how you think about that tension as it relates to the bigger backdrop of your book, which is like a theory of something like capital. It's engaging in the conversation over what is capitalism and how does it change over time and what are those dynamics. So I'm just curious how you think about that, like as an invitation just to, I'm just curious what's on your mind when I bring that up.
So I'm puzzling in that, when you said we can have capitalism without private property. And I thought, wait, what is John saying here? But then I thought to myself, okay, the corporation is not private. It's not private property. It's not owned by anybody, right? I mean, it's, we all know that. I mean, of course, that's not what the standard story goes in your classical economics, but not. But there are private financiers and there are private decision makers in the corporation, and they always have been, right? So I feel like the question of understanding at least what you're saying there in terms of the valuation story, I think in part has to do with the fact that they set prices, but they set prices that generate a sufficient rate of return to finance the institution itself. But the institution, while it is legally chartered, in the European context, perhaps it's legally chartered at the state level, at the national level, in the US, at the state level, it has to give that rate of return, in other words, profitability. So there is an underlying conflict between the private decision makers, and I deliberately use that word because I'm, in lieu of capitalists, the private decision makers in charge of the corporation and workers. That tension remains, and so the question of social costs, whether it be in terms of unstable labor markets, stagnant wages, or environmental degradation, that's, at least that's what I'm trying to get at over here, is that is really the story of the political nature of the corporation. But maybe I didn't quite understand the question, John.
I'm like, I would love to keep this conversation going in the future. Yeah.
Okay. But at least, I mean, that's the way I see it. And, there is a question of how does one conceptualize privacy, at least in regards to the business sector. And the overwhelming majority of private property is actually socially chartered. But over time, increasingly private actors have come to dominate over the last about 150 years, actually. So not just over a short period of, and certainly from the 1970s. So, I mean, the conflictual nature remains. And, that I think is where I'm at in terms of understanding this business of private and social costs.
Great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions from, otherwise I have one, it's a more methodological question perhaps to conclude, but I see we have also Professor Martha McCluskey. Hello, in case, I don't know. All right, so, well, one thing that perhaps links to the theme of the series, which is the dialogue with between political economists and lawyers, is really like the sort of, I want to inquire on how you perceive the current state of affairs with regards to the possibilities for interdisciplinarity and so on. So I have the impression that at least in Europe, it's often the case that even though we want to be doing law and political economy, there seems to be a sort of impasse or certain obstacles in establishing direct, and fruitful channels of communication between legal scholars and political economists. And I think to some extent, the Journal of Law and Political Economy is an example of overcoming this obstacle. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about your experience, how you see the state of affairs right now, and where do you see perhaps, where do you see the potential for enhancing this kind of collaboration and, the ways in which, both disciplines, let's say, can gain the most?
So there are several issues right there. I think that it is at some level it's depressing. And the depressing part of it is that first of all, you've got the dominance of the law and economics tradition and the dominance of economics. So a lot of even lefty people, they may not have been exposed to all these debates within heterodox economics, and that's that. But I'm talking to you from the other side of the river. And from this side of the river, which is heterodox economics, it's a little depressing because oftentimes heterodox economists don't appreciate the centrality of law and what law, in other words, the ontological nature of law itself, they don't get it. And I face a lot of resistance sources. One way I thought that has helped me a lot communicate is to go back to the original institutional economists, whose work so much coincided with the American legal realists, and to sort of exemplify that the contributions of whether it be John Morris Clark or Robert Hale or John R. Commons, that in fact what they were doing was exactly understanding things like property or contracts as legal economic categories, right? And so therefore one doesn't have the luxury of saying that I'm going to only deal with the study of markets without thinking about property and contracts, because you can't. I mean, how do you do that? I mean, I don't even know how you can do that, because the markets are by definition property and contracts, right? I think that if you go back to that institutional economics, that original institutional economics framework, then that's a way by which you could actually reach people, in the sense that you could say, well, everybody says this in heterodox economics, that institute matter, the neoclassicals say it, Hayek says it, everybody says it. The question is, what do we mean by institutions? And that's an epistemological question, but there's also an ontological question, which is that, okay, when we're talking about institutions, what are they? How do they come about? And I feel like, oddly enough, reading Hayek is super useful, at least for me, because I mean, that's the most sophisticated. This guy he got the Nobel Prize in economics, but all his work was on politics and law. And it makes it very clear law, which kind of bubbles up from society, and law precedes legislation, which comes from the state. So he's already constructing a story of economy as being pre-political. And I think that that's a very useful way to actually attack Hayek and that very idea that law, kind of the institutional framework, is kind of pre-political, and say, well, okay, so what were the original institutional economists saying in terms of institutions? And I think that is where I think the conversation is helpful, and it also is useful in terms of reaching both sides, that question of law. Because I mean, look, if you tell economists, including heterodox economists, about law, they freak out. They think, oh God, no, I don't want to deal with all that stuff. But then you say, wait, you yourself said that you believe in institutions. Yeah, I do believe in institutions. And this is senior scholars, right? I got my PhD at the New School, Heterodox Economics Department. I cannot tell you the number of times I've had this weird conversation. Law? Oh yeah, that's something else. Institutions? Yeah, I believe in institutions. Okay. Law is an institution, so like, let's have a conversation. It's the same conversation. I think this is at least for me been the way to go in the sort of intellectual trajectory that I'm on here.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Jamee.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, unless there are any other questions, which I don't think so, I think we can wrap it up. It was really fantastic having you. Thank you for sending us also the book and for having being exposed to this. I think it's a fantastic project. So really looking forward to seeing it in print.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. That was really great. And I think a perfect way to kick off the webinar series. So great having you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Great conversation. Looking forward to more going forward.
Okay. Great. And thank you all for coming.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.